Morning. We now look at the Alter Rebbe's Haggadah and the Rebbe's commentary. Right? We explained this in the past. In addition to a code of Jewish law that the Alter Rebbe authored, which we were learning yesterday and the days before, the Alter Rebbe also compiled a siddur. Right? We explained what that means. Compiling a siddur means that a person, the author here in the case, the Alter Rebbe, siphons through hundreds, 70-something texts. I think there's a certain number that's given of a siddur, and then compiles what he feels is the most correct variant of the text, and he gives instructions what to do throughout the siddur. A siddur includes not just the morning prayers or the daily prayers, but also the year-round prayers, which would include the Seder night. The Alter Rebbe siddur includes a Haggadah, as most good siddurim do. Not siddurim that you're printed in the synagogue, but siddurim printed by scholars that were meant to be published works, like Rebbe and Shapsi Rakshkever, and many others who wrote siddurim. So we're going to learn the Alter Rebbe's Haggadah with the instructions and then see the Rebbe's commentary to that.
Otherwise, we'd be sitting with Siddur this size.
That's right. So they're pared down. The Siddur that we have published are pared down from these original works. Okay, I've mentioned this in the past, like even the Art Scroll Siddur or even the Kahas Siddur here, the one we have. If you read those from beginning to end and remember all the instructions in there, you'd be quite a scholar. Because it has instructions for everything. For I think even high holidays in there. The Seder night's probably no, Seder night's not in there. Yeah, but there's a lot of halachas in there because it says put on tefillin here. It's halachas how to put on tefillin. It says put on tzitzis here. Halachas how to put on tzitzis and so on and so forth. Okay, so let's look at the Haggadah. It's the second paragraph on page Ayin Ches. Rabbi Gamliel. It says Rabbi Gamliel, yeah. So, as I mentioned, this is where we're learning this now because it's taken from our Mishnah. Our Mishnah taught us that at the end of the telling of the story, Rabbi Gamliel instructs us to recap the essential elements and to explain them. Now, I'm not expecting everybody to remember the exact text of the Mishnah, but we will see that the text as it appears in Haggadah is longer than it was in the Mishnah. And the Rebbe is going to comment on that, on those differences. Let's see. Rabbi Gamliel used to say, let me get a
Rabbi Gamliel of the Nazi.
Ooh, good question. Which Rabbi Gamliel is it? We're going to see that in the Rebbe's commentary. Good question. Which Rabbi Gamliel is it? And you know what? We're going to read the text and you'll tell me who you think it is.
I don't know.
Sorry? Yes, there's more than one Rabbi Gamliel. More than two Rabbi Gamliels, actually. They were grandchildren of each other. Okay? Hillel Zaken, Gamliel, Shimon, Yehuda, and then more further down. A lineage of Nisim, of leaders of the Jewish people. Okay, so I have the text in front of me, and we're going to see where's the difference. No, whoops. Let's just wait. Okay, Rabbi Gamliel used to say, Kol Shalai Amar, Shloisha Dvarim Elu, anyone who hasn't said these three things, the Pesach on the Seder night, hasn't fulfilled his obligation. Which obligation? Which obligation? No, which obligation have we fulfilled if we didn't say these three things?
Reciting the story.
The obligation to recite the story, even though I mentioned there was one opinion which says that the obligation in question here is the obligation of eating matzah and eating maror and eating the Pesach. That if you haven't spoken these three things, you haven't fulfilled the obligation of eating matzah. But we don't rule that way. We rule that the obligation in question here is the obligation to recite the story. That you have to say you have to cover these three elements, otherwise you haven't fulfilled your obligation. Okay, and they are the following three subjects: Pesach, matzah, maror. Okay, now the next line is completely skipped in the Mishnah. The Mishnah goes like this: Pesach, and then the next line, Al Shum Shepasach. This part of the Mishnah is now added. Pesach, this Pesach offering, that our forefathers used to eat when the temple stood. Al Shumma, for what reason are they eating it? Answer: because God passed over, the word Pasach meaning passed over, the homes of our forefathers in Egypt. So the Mishnah skips the preamble, which says that our forefathers ate and the temple stood. That part's not in the Mishnah. The Mishnah just says the Pesach is for the fact that God jumped over the Jewish people's homes. I just alluded to which of Gamliel it is.
Wait, say that again.
Okay, so look at this. Look at the line Pesach, right? This is how our Mishnah reads it. Pesach, and then it goes to the next word line, Al Shum. skipping the whole line above. So our Mishnah reads, Pesach, for the reason that God jumped over the homes of our forefathers. Whereas the Haggadah adds the following line, Pesach, that our forefathers ate when the temple stood. For what reason? For the reason that when God jumped over the homes of our forefathers in Egypt.
It must be the elder because it's during the time the temple stood.
Well, no. 1 second. Okay, so if you say the Pesach that our forefathers used to eat when the temple stand, so where are you standing if you see such a line? After the temple. If you say the Pesach that was eaten the Pesach that our forefathers ate when the temple stood, it means you're after, right? But if you just say the Pesach, for what reason? Because you're actually eating the Pesach.
Yeah, then it's pre. Yeah.
So the Haggadah, the Mishnah says Pesach, because God jumped over the homes of our forefathers, without qualifying when it's eaten, implying that the person there is actually eating it. So this is Rebbe Levi, the elder, who's actually standing when the temple stands. Whereas the Haggadah adds and says, well, we are not in the temple times. If we're going to add the line which says the Pesach that our forefathers ate when the temple stood. Yeah, this is based on Rebbe's comment, which we will see. We follow that?
Smart.
Follow
Because
that?
that was the whole purpose.
What do you mean?
That's when he passed over all the homes.
Okay, there are 3 time periods here.
Passover.
1 second. There are 3 time periods. Just make this clear. There are 3 time periods here. There's our forefathers in Egypt. 1 second. There's our forefathers in Egypt. Time period number 1. Time period number 2 is when temple stands and they're eating Pesach offering. And time period 2. Time period 3 is us here today who don't have a temple.
Yeah.
Who is speaking in the sentence? Which one of these 3 is speaking in the
The
sentence?
first one.
The first one, they're talking. Who's talking? Listen to the words. The Pesach that our forefathers ate when the temple stood.
So
For what reason did they eat it? They ate it because God jumped over our forefathers. Who's speaking when they say that
Could
sentence?
be the second
The second one?
or the third one.
Why would listen to the words again? The Pesach that our forefathers ate when the temple stood.
Yeah.
Who's speaking?
Listen.
Who is speaking?
Post.
Listen to the words.
Post.
The Passover that my forefathers ate when the temple stands. So where am I? Am I when the temple stands?
Post temple.
The second part after it happened.
Listen to again. 3 time periods. People in Egypt.
Yeah.
People when the temple stood,
Yeah.
and us today.
Yeah.
Now listen to the statement. The Pesach that my forefathers ate when the temple stood is because God jumped over. Who said that statement? Which one of these 3 time periods?
Could be the first one.
The first one?
Yeah.
Listen to the statements. The Pesach that my forefathers ate when the temple stood. The first generation said that? They'd be talking about a Pesach that their forefathers ate? So who would be talking about a Pesach that their forefathers ate?
See what you mean.
Only people after the temple is destroyed. Otherwise, you wouldn't say the Pesach my forefathers ate. You'd be actually eating it. So you would say the Pesach that I'm eating if you were standing in temple times. Follow?
Yeah.
It's a question of phraseology, Alan. Don't get stuck by where it happens. Who's saying these words? If you're eating the Pesach in front of you and you want to talk about it, what would you say? You would say, hey, the Pesach that I'm eating, here's the reason, right? So you wouldn't say the Pesach that my forefathers are eating because you're eating it. So if I say the Pesach my forefathers ate, that means I'm not eating it. I'm talking about what they ate, which means I'm after temple time. You follow that?
But can't it be in the second one?
Why would they say their forefathers ate the Pesach? They're eating it. When you talk about the matzah, do you say, hey, the matzah my forefathers ate? You say the matzah I'm eating because you're actually eating it.
You could say it happened when my forefathers ate it. That was the beginning.
Right, but you're talking about the symbolism of the matzah. You'd be talking about the symbolism of the matzah you're eating, not the matzah your forefathers ate. Right? So the Haggadah adds, our forefathers ate when the temple stood, because the Haggadah is written after. But the Mishnah doesn't have that line, the Pesach that our forefathers ate. Because Rebbe Gamliel is speaking, and Rebbe Gamliel is there when the temple stood, which means he ate the Pesach offering.
He skips that line.
Oh.
He skips the forefathers line. So you know,
Because he's actually eating.
You know, it's temple times. It's not
This is the Rebbe's proof that the Rebbe Gamliel here is the Rebbe Gamliel the elder, notwithstanding the fact that the Haggadah says the Pesach our forefathers ate. Because that line, our forefathers ate, is added by the Haggadah. It's not in the Mishnah. Here we go. Okay.
Timeline.
Gives you a timeline. That's the Rebbe's comment. Okay, we'll get there. We'll see it again when we get to the Rebbe's comment. Okay, the text continues. Shenamar, here's the verse which indicates that Pesach is to remember God jumping over those houses, because it says in the verse in generation 1, V'amartem, God says, and you shall say, Zevach Pesach Hashem. This is an offering of Pesach for God. Asher Pasach al Bate Bnei Yisrael, because he passed over that word Pesach, the homes of the Jewish people, the Mitzrayim in Egypt, the Nokfais Mitzrayim when he struck Egypt, Vesbatenu Hitzil, and our homes he saved. When the people bowed and prostrated themselves. Okay, so this is a verse indicating that Pesach is to remember the fact that God jumped over the Egyptians. That verse does appear, jumped over the homes of our forefathers. That verse does appear in our Mishnah in the brackets and not in its entirety, but the verse is there. It just begins the verse and says etc. in our Mishnah. So that's not a major distinction, because the Haggadah just elongates that which the Mishnah said etc. about. Okay, now comes the instruction. You see the little line in between the paragraphs there? Little line?
Yeah.
Says, yes. So what did our Mishnah say? What did the Mishnah say when it said to, what did the Gemara say you should do when you recite this matzah? What is it for? What did our Mishnah say? What did our Gemara say to do?
Touch it or point to it.
The Mishnah said, Yagbiya, raise it up.
The Mishnah said, lift it up.
Mishnah said, lift it up. And what did the halacha say? Also lift it up. Everybody should see it. And that way they're endeared to it. That's what the Rebbe told us in the halacha. Okay? Here, the Rebbe gives us not a complete instruction, which again, we'll see that it was comment about. This is the words of the Rebbe. Take the portion of bread. Take, person means like the piece. Take the piece of bread in your hand and say the following. Doesn't say to raise it up.
Doesn't say which piece either, does it?
Oh, good question. So it's
the middle one, I would assume.
It's the middle one is
broken.
Sorry?
The lechem on.
The Rebbe doesn't comment on it, but presumably, prusa means a broken piece of matzah, of bread, as opposed to naitel hakikar. He takes the loaf in his hands. Prusa is a piece, indicating
signifying.
No, it's just a question of language. What the word he uses is take the prusa. What does the word prusa mean? Prusa means a piece of bread, as opposed to naitel hakikar. Kikar would be take the loaf, which would mean a whole loaf. Prusa means a piece. So he's telling you to take the broken matzah. But note, he doesn't say, take it in your hand and show it to everybody, as he said in the Shulchan Aruch. Didn't say that. He just said, take it in your hand. Didn't say to lift it up. Didn't say to show it to everybody.
We lost the demonstration aspect
of the class.
No.
But naitel prusa literally means take the piece in your hand. Whereas the Mishnah said, raise it up. Halacha said, raise it up so everybody can see and be endeared to it. Right? That's what they said.
So raising up implies to demonstrate, to show others.
That's what the wrote in the Shulchan Aruch. We wrote that yesterday or 2 days ago. Pick it up, show everybody so that they sort of endears them. It creates an endearment toward the mitzvah.
Here it's just saying,
take it in your hand.
In the Haggadah, it's just saying,
take it in your hand.
Take it in your hand.
Okay, we'll see that I was comment about that soon. Okay, so Yomer, you should say, what should you say when you take the piece in your hand? Quote, this is what you should say, again from our Mishnah. This matzah that we eat, not what our forefathers ate, but this matzah we eat, because we're eating the matzah. Al Shuma, for what purpose is it? This part is also skipped in the Mishnah. The Mishnah just goes matzah and then skips all to after the parentheses al shum shel hispik. In other words, the question answer form isn't in our Mishnah. This matzah we eat, what is it for? This matzah, this Pesach our forefathers ate when the temple stood, what's it for? That question is deleted from the Mishnah, and the Mishnah just goes straight to the explanation. But the Haggadah puts it in question and answer form. Okay, so Haggadah writes matzah this matzah that we eat, for what purpose is it? Al shum, because shel hispik but seker shel avseinu lahachmitz. Because the dough of our forefathers did not have time to rise. This part is not in our Mishnah. Until so they didn't have time to rise before God revealed himself to us, the Golam, and redeemed them from forefathers.
That's not in the Mishnah.
Not in the Mishnah. The Mishnah just says matzah for the reason that God redeemed our forefathers. As is written, they baked the dough that they were taken out of Egypt. Just skip it, goes straight to there, without saying the whole backstory that God that it was too quick to go out. But Rambam's text of the Mishnah does have this variant, not the question, what's it for, but does have this part of the text which says, because the dough had no time to rise. That is in the Rambam's variant of the Mishnah, not in our variant of the Mishnah.
How do we know, sorry, but how do we know when Rambam cites something in halachas that he's citing from the Mishnah?
Okay, so Rambam.
It's not, unless he's specifically stating that he's reciting from the Mishnah.
Okay, good question. In this case, I'm looking at the margins of the Gemara here, which tells me that the Rambam had that text.
Oh, okay.
And it just cites to the fact that so it's written in halacha, but doesn't say so. And the same thing in the Rosh, which is another one of the commentaries. And then it says here, no, that's something else already. Okay, we have to look up Pirush Mishnah, right? We learned this that the Rambam had a commentary to the Mishnah. So we have to look up the commentary to the Mishnah to see how it's written there. That would tell us how the Rambam's text is, right? We learned about that in the Rebbe's talk.
Yeah.
Okay. Anyway, continues the Haggadah. Shenamar, here's the verse which proves that the matzah is there to remember the fact that the dough didn't have time to rise. Because the verse reads, quote, they baked the dough that they took out of Egypt, the Jewish people, ugois matzahs, non-leavened cakes. Best way to translate it. Ugois is a cake or cookie, cracker, matzahs that are non-leavened. Because it didn't rise. Why didn't it rise? Continues the verse. Because they were expelled from Egypt. They were banished.
Sorry, this is the verse directly from the
Torah. Yeah. All right. That's the verse. Because they were expelled from Egypt. Right? They didn't have opportunity to wait. And they also didn't prepare any provisions. So they took the bread and ran out, and therefore didn't get time to rise. This is the verse. Okay. Then says the Haggadah. So that was the Haggadah text itself. Now comes out there was instruction in the three little words, the words there between. Right? Take the mortar in your hand. Again, doesn't say raise it up. Doesn't say to show it to anybody. But remember, we pointed out. No, the Shulchan does say to show it to anybody. But here it just says again, take the mortar in your hand. Doesn't say to lift it up. So you take the mortar in your hand. The Yomer, you should say the next paragraph. Again, from our Mishnah with some distinction, with some changes, especially the question-answer form. Right? The question-answer form does not appear in the Mishnah. This mortar that we eat, al shulma. For what purpose is it? Al shum, for the purpose that the Egyptians embittered. The word embittered, the same root word as marar, the lives of our forefathers in Egypt. Shenamar, proof text that tells us that marar is associated with the embitterment, as the verse reads, and they, the Egyptians, embittered their lives with hard labor, with brick and mortar, and all work in the field, all of the work, which they labored, in them, the farach, with great extraneous labor. End quote. Okay? So this then is the text of the Haggadah as lifted from our Mishnah from Rabbi Gamliel. Let's go to the next page and see the Rebbe's commentary.
So the only part that wasn't listed in the Mishnah in the Haggadah is the part about the leavening of the bread. The reason for the
in our text of the Mishnah, that's not there. So there's a few things that aren't in the Mishnah. Number one, the statement which says that the Pesach was eaten by our forefathers. That's not in there. Right. The question-answer form, which is this Pesach which we eat, why is it for? Because the Mishnah just goes to because. Matzah because this. Now putting the question-answer form. And the whole verses aren't quoted in our and what you just mentioned, which is our Mishnah doesn't say
the reason for
this is because of the leavening. It just says because God redeemed us. It skips that whole part of the leavening of the rush and just quotes the verse, as well as the Mishnah has all the verses in brackets and just has the beginning of the verse with the words etc. Okay, so this is a distinction.
More of a
more concise,
abbreviated.
Yes. So let's see now the Rebbe's commentary, top of the page, Ayin Tes. First of all, it says the Rebbe always gives the sources. The Rebbe always gives the sources for the text of the Haggadah. Always, every paragraph, the first comment the Rebbe says is where it comes from. Okay? So it says the Rebbe, Rabbi Gamliel, dash, of hallelujah. You see on the top of the page Ayin Tes there?
Yeah, sorry, just a quick question. The commentary that the Rebbe inserts, is it from his own scholarship or was it?
His own scholarship and research at the behest of his father-in-law. Yeah. His father-in-law asked him to compile a Haggadah. So he calls it a compilation of a compilation of reasons and customs. That's how he frames it.
But you would think that when the okay, so this was the alter Rebbe's.
And the Rebbe is commenting on it 7 generations later, right? Now, the Rebbe's commentary to Haggadah in this book is kind of like a Rashi. It's a running commentary which explains the Haggadah in its most basic text, its most basic halachic level, with added sometimes Kabbalistic ideas, but mostly it's like a running commentary, almost like a Rashi. Like if the words are misplaced, he'll comment on why the words sound misplaced. Like Rashi, like that. He'll tell you the source. Yes, but like Rashi, in that simplified commentary, there's many layers of depth, as we've seen already in many of our classes. But it's not the same as there was commentary when he would give essays, like we learned the essay about the difference between Rambam and Alter Rebbe, and the halach about in every generation should you see yourself or demonstrate yourself. That's a much more elaborate, in-depth analysis. That's not to be found in here, because in here it's just a running commentary like a Rashi almost. Okay, so first thing the Rebbe says is the source of the text. The Rebbe says as follows: Rabbi Gamliel dash v'nem l'fanav halaluka. So they were saying, from this part, which says Rabbi Gamliel used to say, anyone who says these 3 things, all the way till the text which concludes, and we will shall say before you Hallelujah, which is the end of the Haggadah before Hallel starts, which includes B'chol Devadur, all of that, says the Rebbe, is Mishnah Psachim Design Aleph Beis. Comes from the Mishnah in Psachim, page 116, A and B, the Mishnah we learned. Now the Rebbe adds, Ulah Rambam, the Rambam, Girsa Acheres Sham. The Rambam had a different variant to the text of the Mishnah. Therefore, he has a different text in his Haggadah as well, because he had a different text of the Mishnah.
He had a different version of the Mishnah.
Oh, and we've already discussed some of that.
We've had this
at great length.
This theme has come up.
That's right. Which Rambam quotes, the way in which he quotes them,
about demonstration,
all of that. Clearly, Rambam had a different variant to the text. Okay. Then the Rebbe adds like this. This comes from Rashbam, as you can see at the end of the line.
Yeah.
The Rabbi Gamliel said, anyone who doesn't say these 3 things hasn't fulfilled his obligation. What does it mean not to say? How much do I have to say? Says the Rebbe.
And what obligation?
That part, okay, we'll get to in a second.
What we said.
That will be next, yes.
Sorry, not the eating.
That will be next. Kol Shaloi Amar, anyone who didn't say, says the Rebbe quoting from Rashbam, Shaloi Perish Taiman. If you didn't explain their reasons, which means if you translate the words of Rabbi Gamliel directly, anyone who doesn't say these 3 things hasn't fulfilled his obligation. So all I have to do is just say them. Pesach, Matzah, and Maror. But Rashbam ends this, no. When Rabbi Gamliel said that you have to say these 3 things, he means you need to explain these 3 things, which is what the Mishnah goes on to do. What's the reason for Pesach? What's the reason for Matzah? What's the reason for Maror? So it doesn't just say them, it explains them. Yes? Which means one more thing, which is actually something from Rebbe's commentary that I wanted to do, which we never did. Every time it comes up, I remind myself, which is, one second, where's the Rashbam? Yeah, like Piddush Taiman. So, which means like this. You have to understand these 3 paragraphs.
That's interesting.
If the halacha was just to say them, then say them. Like for example, we learned this in Saita. There's some things you're allowed to do in translation, some things you don't do in translation. Right?
Going to war and
all this, or the benching, the Shema, the learning of Torah, the prayers, right?
Yes.
So it comes down to if you have to understand what you're saying or not, or just the words important. So Rabbi Gamliel's statement just said
the priestly blessing.
The priestly blessing, that's right. Where you don't have to translate it, which means you don't understand what you're saying because God's blessing anyway, right? But when it comes to here, if Rabbi Gamliel just said you have to say these 3 things, okay, so then say it. But now that Rashbam tells us, and Rebbe quotes it in Haggadah here, that you have to explain it, it means you now have to understand it. Which is similar to the Mishnah, which told us that when the father answers the question to the child, the Gemara said, the Mishnah said, Lafi daita shall ben alav malamdai. In accordance with the intelligence of the child, the father explains it to him, which means it has to be explained and understood to the person listening. Which means you can't just read it in Hebrew. If you don't understand Hebrew, you got to understand what you're saying. Which is one of those comments that I wanted to get to, which we didn't, which maybe we'll get to tomorrow. I'll remind myself. So here too, it has to be explained.
I keep thinking like the Rashbam when we learned that when the kid asks about why are we doing this, I thought the Rashbam's position was, maybe I have it backwards.
Yes, Rashbam said you don't have to
That's,
answer.
oh, you don't, that's it, you fulfilled.
Yes, that was
the
Rashbam's.
Rashbam?
Yes.
So it seems like a
No,
contradiction.
but in the answer, he has to be explained.
I'm sorry?
In the answer, when you tell him our forefathers were slaves, the kid has to understand what you're saying.
So it's not necessarily have to recite the 4 questions.
No,
but he
but
has
the
to
answer-
explain.
Exactly.
Okay, so this is in line with.
This is completely in line. So here too, if Pesach, Matzah, and Maror are the essential things, and they don't just have to be said, they have to be explained, then the readers have to understand it. So this is one of those paragraphs which we should go around the table and saying it in English, these 3 paragraphs, because otherwise you don't understand it. You're missing the point here.
Right, it's like
It makes the
also,
whole thing more meaningful.
Sorry?
It makes the whole
Yes,
service
for meaningful, there's a lot of things you can do for meaningful, but you have to make sure to fulfill your obligations.
understandable.
But you have to make sure you fulfill your obligations first and foremost,
it's
right?
also when
So,
certain-
and then you have to add meaning to that. So the fulfillment of the obligation is, note like this: when it comes to prayer, you should understand it, because your prayer should be meaningful. But if you don't understand it, did you not fulfill your obligation to pray? You did. You said the words. Certainly, when it comes to Shema, that's the case.
It's like searching for hummus. There's a part you have to say it in your language that you understand it.
Correct.
It's a declaration.
That's right.
Otherwise,
You didn't say anything.
You didn't say anything.
You're declaring the chametz onus. I'm not to understand what you're saying. You didn't do anything, right? So likewise here, the halacha is you have to understand what you're saying, not just for added meaning, but for the fulfillment of the obligation. Shall I pirish time when you have to explain the reasons? Okay. Next comment to what you were saying before. Lo yotze deche vasai. Rabbi Gamliel said, if you don't say these 3 things, which we explained, say doesn't mean just to verbalize, but it means to explain. So if you don't explain these 3 things, lo yotze deche vasai, you haven't fulfilled your obligation. Says the Rebbe, when it says you don't fulfill your obligation, it means you haven't fulfilled your obligation karoi, properly.
Oh, so it's almost.
But biblically speaking, if you don't do these paragraphs, you still fulfill your obligation. It's a big chiddush. Rabbi Gamliel didn't say that. Rabbi Gamliel said if you don't say these 3 things, you haven't fulfilled your obligation. Says that actually, it doesn't mean you haven't fulfilled your obligation at all. It means you haven't fulfilled your obligation properly. But biblically speaking, you fulfilled your obligation.
By saying that.
Just by saying it.
Not explaining.
No, just by, no.
All right, got it mixed up.
If you skip Rabbi Gamliel said like this, if you don't say the following, you haven't fulfilled your obligation. So if I just stop there, what would you say? That if you didn't explain these paragraphs, you didn't do the mitzvah. Says the Rebbe, you did do the mitzvah. You didn't do it properly. So when Rabbi Gamliel says you must say these 3 things, otherwise you haven't fulfilled your obligation, it means you haven't fulfilled your obligation properly unless you said these 3 things.
That's only if you're thinking of yourself.
What do you mean?
Because if you're sitting with a bunch of people and kids and reciting the Haggadah and you're just filling your obligation, it's like a teacher is going, he's reading the whole thing and he's not explaining anything.
Okay, let's put that aside for a second. We're mixing up 2 different comments here. 2 different comments. Number 1, when Rabbi Gamliel said to say these 3 things, he meant to explain it. Number 1, shelf that comment.
According to the Rosh.
According to Rashbam, shelf that. Rabbi Gamliel also said, if you haven't said these 3 things, which means explain, if you haven't said them, you haven't fulfilled your obligation. Which means, if I stopped at this point, I would say, if I read the entire Haggadah and didn't read the part which says here that you have to explain these 3 things, did I do the mitzvah to tell my child the story? No, I didn't. Says Rebbe, yes, you did. So how come Rabbi Gamliel said you haven't fulfilled your obligation? He meant you haven't fulfilled your obligation properly. So if you skip these 3 things, you still fulfilled your obligation, just not properly. Biblically speaking, you still did the mitzvah.
And this is not something that's to be found in the Gemara.
Not in the Gemara, but in the commentaries to the Gemara, we'll see in the parentheses. So where does this come from? Put it in the parentheses. Rabbi Nissim, Psachim Sham, the commentary of Rabbi Nissim. This is also implied by the opinion of the Rif, the Rashba, and the Budram. How is this implied? It comes down to this. Shekosvu, because they are of the view, just by the minimal speaking, there's a big discussion, which the Rebbe actually discusses in his Haggadah earlier, which I'm not going to get into right now, but just for the purpose of this conversation. What exactly do you have to do to fulfill your obligation to tell the story of the Exodus? The Haggadah says, quoting from our sages, the more the merrier. So tell the story for a whole night long. Okay, but every mitzvah has to have a minimum requirement. Right? So what's the minimum requirement to fulfill the mitzvah of telling the story of the Exodus?
So a child can understand.
So it takes one sentence, which is, we were enslaved in Egypt, and now we're free.
Yeah.
I said those words, I did my obligation, done. That's what these commentaries say. What happened to explaining Pesach Matzah and Maror? Didn't Rebbe Gamliel say you don't fulfill your obligation unless you do Pesach Matzah and Maror?
Mhm.
So how come these commentators are saying all I have to say is we were slaves, now we're free? I must conclude, therefore, says the Rebbe,
We have to say
that when Rebbe Gamliel says to say these three things, it's not inherent to the mitzvah itself, it's to do with mitzvah properly. Because otherwise, these commentaries don't stand.
Mm.
In other words, like this. When these commentaries have a whole discussion on what's the minimum I have to say to fulfill the obligation, why don't they say the minimum is to cover these three things? They don't say that. They say, what's the minimum? I was a slave, now I'm free. That's enough. Why are they saying that? You follow what I'm asking?
That's the Rebbe put together.
Oh, so
That it's
yeah.
you didn't do it properly.
exactly. And therefore, and that's what it was concluding. Therefore, when Rabbi Gamliel says if you don't say these three things, you haven't fulfilled your obligation, he doesn't mean if you skipped it, you didn't fulfill your obligation at all. Because we know from the other sources that just saying the story, the minimal, you fulfilled your obligation. What Rabbi Gamliel means you haven't fulfilled your obligation properly. But the basic bare minimum, you did. Even just by saying, hi, we were slaves in Egypt and we're out now. That would be enough on the most basic bare minimum level. But it's not proper. It's not done properly unless, as Rabbi Gamliel says, you discuss and explain these three things.
If I was there and he says what you just said, because we were slaves in Egypt, so what's that thing you're holding in your hand?
Sorry, say again? What did you say again?
If the leader would say it's because we were slaves in Egypt, that's it.
Yeah.
And then he lifts up the matzah. What's that? Why aren't you holding bread?
So there's the answer. So if he just said because we were slaves in Egypt, he fulfilled his obligation.
Yeah.
It's not proper.
According to him.
No, by all
According
standards,
yeah.
by halachic standards.
Yeah.
But you haven't done it properly because you haven't really explained the main elements.
That's right.
And that's what Rabbi Gamliel is saying. That's Rebbe's interpreting Rabbi Gamliel, that you haven't fulfilled the obligation properly unless you explain. Okay, one last comment since we already covered it, and then we'll continue tomorrow. And the next comment from Rebbe is like this: Shahayu, third paragraph on the right-hand side, ayin tes. Yeah. So the Haggadah says this Pesach that our forefathers ate when the temple stood. But then when it comes to matzah, we say this matzah that we eat. Okay. So says the Rebbe, calls that all of this the reference to Pesach that our forefathers ate when the temple stood, as well as the reference to matzah that we eat. Ain't in the Mishnah. It's not in the Mishnah. The Mishnah doesn't say this matzah that we eat. What's it for? It just says matzah because the dough didn't have time to rise. Maror because they embittered. Pesach because the Hashem dumped over our own. Without qualifying who's eating. But the Haggadah does say who's eating. When it comes to Pesach, it says that our forefathers ate. When it comes to matzah, it says we eat. Right? It says the Rebbe Vu Aisafa in Misadar Haggadah. This is added by the one who collated the Haggadah, taken from the Mishnah, adding in this text. Now, now this resolves a problem that's raised in other commentaries. The problem raised in other commentaries is, which Rabbi Gamliel is it? Rashbatz, I have to look it up again. Oh yeah, I looked it up yesterday and I don't remember. Anyway,
I thought we concluded.
We did. I foreshadowed to you what I was going to say. This is where I got it from. This comes where I got it from, right? Because there are commentaries which question which Rabbi Gamliel is this, and they say it can't be the original Rabbi Gamliel because it says that which our forefathers ate,
Right.
and Rebbe is resolving that problem by saying, hold on a second, the Mishnah doesn't say that which our forefathers ate, so it actually is the Rabbi Gamliel because he was actually eating the Pesach. It's the Mishnah, it's the Haggadah, organized years later that added these words to make it for us, because there's a difference between the Pesach offering, which we're not eating, and the matzah, which we are eating. Right? This is what we've done before. I got that from this comment that I got here. Okay. God willing, tomorrow, more commentary. Specifically, we'll get to the difference in custom. The Mishnah said to raise it up. The Haggadah says, take it in your hand.
Right.
And we're going to see what the actual Chabad custom is in the end. Okay, wonderful day, Eden.
Yes, Rabbi. All the very best to you and all the very best to you all. Have a wonderful day.
Same to you. Take care.
God bless you. Take care.